Las Vegas, Nevada. The most popular hip-hop star on the planet, Tupac Shakur, bleeds out in a BMW, victim of a drive-by shooting. 6 months later, rival rapper Biggie Smalls is brutally gunned down on the streets of L.A. in an eerily similar fashion. Both murders are forever linked and currently unsolved. Who killed Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls?
They'd have killed him right in front of the Pope.
Some say they were murdered by their closest allies.
They put a hit out on Pac for $1 million.
Were they truly victims of an East Coast, West Coast rap rivalry? Or was that just a cover for something more sinister?
Guns, drugs, money. This is a really bad formula here.
Others believe it was all orchestrated by the U.S. government.
Tupac's murder and Biggie's murder, they couldn't have been done by just gangbangers. These were professional hits.
Mystery? Not for long. He was only 25 when he died, but Tupac Shakur was already considered one of the greatest hip-hop artists of all time. Christopher Wallace, a.k.a. Biggie Smalls, a.k.a. Notorious B.I.G., was 1 year younger when he was gunned down, but the 24-year-old rapper was already dubbed the savior of East Coast hip-hop. Two superstars shot dead 6 months apart, both killed in their car while stopped at a light. Both murders never solved. The official story, gang violence. Tupac and Biggie were already victims of an East Coast-West Coast rap rivalry that got way out of hand. Tupac on the West Coast was part of Suge Knight's Death Row Records. Biggie was on the East Coast with Sean Puffy Combs' label Bad Boy Records. So the rivalry escalates. Tupac is targeted. Then Biggie is killed in retaliation. But no arrests were ever made. So that's just a theory, and it's one of many. Some have reason to believe Tupac was killed by his employer, Suge Knight. Others say Suge was the real target, and Tupac's death was an accident. And finally, some go so far as to say Tupac was assassinated by the FBI. Sounds crazy? Well, we'll see. My mission? To test these theories, separate fact from fiction, and ultimately do what no one else could. Solve the unsolvable. First, let's find out what we really know about the nights these two murders took place.
Tupac and Biggie, they were both at the top of their game at the time that they were killed. They were both selling millions and millions of records.
It's hard to believe that the murders of Biggie and Tupac weren't connected in some sort of way. There was the context of what was happening at the time and it being just such a high-profile rivalry between the two, but then also the timing, 6 months apart.
As we dug deeper into it, we found ourselves swimming in theories.
Tupac arrived in Las Vegas on September 7th, and he was going into Las Vegas specifically to attend the Mike Tyson fight.
The Tyson-Selden fight was one of the shortest fights in boxing history. The fight lasted about a minute and a half. It was that fast.
And so Tupac and Suge did not linger, and they headed out pretty quickly. Las Vegas is east, west, south, north. There are only a couple ways to get anywhere. Everything's crisscross. So they were headed down one of the routes from the Strip to get to the club. Tupac's music playing like crazy. Sunroof rolled open, and Tupac's elbows out the car window.
They got up to the intersection at Flamingo and Koval. They faced a red light. A white car with some passengers in it rolled up right beside Tupac and Suge's BMW. An arm came out and started to open fire on the vehicle.
From the forensics and evidence at the scene, the bullets came from the left rear passenger window of the Cadillac, aimed at the passenger door where Tupac was sitting shotgun next to Suge Knight. Suge Knight ended up with a partial bullet in the base of his skull, and Tupac ended up getting shot 5 times.
The Las Vegas police initially thought this was just a shooting. Tupac wasn't dead. Suge wasn't really shot. I mean, he may have had a bullet fragment, that was it. And so they didn't take this very seriously. They looked at it as some gang-related thing. I don't think they understood who Tupac was. They didn't treat this like a murder scene, and they really didn't do the investigation they should have done.
Two of the guys that was in the entourage came straight to the club and had told us that Suge and Pac had just got shot. And we was informed that Tupac was in pretty bad shape.
Tupac didn't immediately die. Tupac lived for another 6 days.
When I heard the news about it, I was in jail in Atlanta. My family's telling me that he lost a lot of blood, and he's telling us to let his spirit go. I think that's what gave Tupac's mother, Fanny, the courage to ask the doctors to let him go. They pulled the plug on him.
You have the Tupac murder, that's a drive-by shooting. 6 months later, you have the Biggie Smalls murder.
Biggie dying such a short time after, it had to be directly related to Tupac's death.
Biggie and Bad Boy Records were in Los Angeles for 30 days.
He came here to promote his album.
And the last day that Biggie's gonna be here is the party that happens at the Peterson Automotive Museum.
At some point, Biggie decided he wanted to leave, and he was going to leave with Sean Combs. They waited for their cars to show up, and when the cars showed up, they left the Peterson Auto Museum.
And just like Tupac, Biggie Smalls' window was unrolled. They're stopped at an intersection outside the Peterson Automotive Museum at Wilshire on the Miracle Mile.
A car comes cruising up right on the right-hand side of his vehicle, opens fire on them, and fatally wounds Christopher Wallace.
This took place very quickly. You know, the shooting happened in a matter of seconds.
Fire department, go ahead.
We're on Fairfax and Wilshire.
What's wrong?
We're man shot in our car right now. Okay, they drove up next to us and just shot us the car on the passenger side.
Okay, somebody's already on the way.
Big, you hear me, baby?
There's definitely a connection between these two killings.
There was always this kind of natural assumption that somehow these were probably related. I mean, it's only been 6 months and the two biggest rap stars in the world are now dead, and there was a lot of connections going on between all of these peripheral players. We knew that there was a direct personal conflict between Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls. We knew that there was conflict going on between the CEO of Bad Boy Records and the CEO of Death Row Records, Puffy Combs and Suge Knight. Everybody knew at the time that Death Row Records was affiliated with blood gangs primarily. We began to realize that there was a strong affiliation between Bad Boy Records and some Southside Compton Crips. Shootings had already taken place, armed confrontations had already taken place, public dissing has already taken place, and this was just obvious that within this conflict was probably going to be the answers behind these murders.
Yeah, it's definitely looking like these two murders are connected. I mean, their lives were just too intertwined for their death to be unrelated random acts. But my question is, how are these shootings connected? To answer that, I need to know more about Tupac and Biggie's relationship. How did two of the biggest stars on the planet become mortal enemies?
Around 1993, Pac's trajectory was going up, while Big was just coming out of his gate. But Pac thought Biggie was the best rapper after him. He was like the best thing smoking. And Pac did everything he could to help Biggie get on his feet, as far as getting a deal, helping him get exposure. When Pac did a show, he'll let Big open up for him. I mean, Pac just genuinely dug Biggie. He just liked it.
The East Coast, West Coast hip-hop war began when Tupac went to record at Quad Studios in New York City. Biggie Smalls and Puffy Combs happened to be recording there as well. And Tupac got robbed.
He was almost killed. He was shot 5 times. And not only was he shot, he was stomped in and out of consciousness. That's what the beef was. It was that he got shot and almost murdered.
Tupac held Biggie accountable for what happened to him at the studio. Being ambushed on someone's own property or on their own territory, he didn't hold him responsible, but he held him accountable.
It was the catalyst for Tupac really coming hard at their camp. On songs and interviews, even in the streets. Like, he was just on this whole anti-bad boy thing after that.
Tupac, was injured from the attack, but he was more upset about the fact that nobody was watching his back. And he blamed Biggie and the East Coast crew for that.
In 1996, Tupac Shakur was shot dead in Las Vegas. 6 months later, Christopher Wallace, a.k.a. Biggie Smalls, was shot dead on the streets of Los Angeles. 2 eerily similar murders forever linked and still unsolved. Were they victims of an East Coast-West Coast rap rivalry? Or was that just a cover for something more sinister? So we know Tupac and Biggie started out as friends. But after Tupac was robbed and shot 5 times in a New York recording studio, he blamed Biggie and his East Coast crew for not protecting him. The way Pac saw it, he was on Biggie's turf, Biggie should have had his back. Fine, but that's just a beef between 2 friends. The East Coast-West Coast feud was being played at the highest level between the CEOs of Death Row and Bad Boy. So was it possible Tupac and Biggie were just pawns in their high-stakes game?
A striking resemblance in the Biggie Smalls shooting to Tupac's was that both their record producers were with them in either their car or a car ahead when they were shot.
We knew there was a history of bad blood between the CEO of Bad Boy Records, Puffy Combs, and the CEO of Death Row Records, Suge Knight.
When it came to the money, this rivalry became heated and bitter between Suge and Puffy.
Suge Knight was a Compton native. He then became the CEO of Death Row Records. He began to bring gang members from his neighborhood on as employees.
Suge owned LA at the time. He's big, he's got a lot of money, he got all these gangsters around him all the time, and they violent. There's always guns, or there's always blood. People are scared to death of him. Scared of him.
And then on the East Coast, you have Sean Combs with his record label.
After Tupac was shot, Puffy Combs was on high alert, and so he made a habit of hiring bodyguards. And when he was in LA, he would hire the Crips as bodyguards.
So you had all of these different interests and gang interests. That was just a toxic stew.
The East Coast-West Coast feud really began August of 1994. The bodyguards of both Puff Daddy and Suge Knight. They were in a club, they got into a huge argument.
And that argument spilled out into the parking lot where a shooting occurred. The victim of that shooting was one of Suge Knight's closest friends and his own personal bodyguard, a guy named Jake Robles. The suspect in that murder was a bodyguard and close friend of Puffy Combs.
Suge always blamed Puffy for the murder of his very dear friend.
And so now you've got blood on the ground, one bodyguard killing another bodyguard, and at that point, the rivalry has now reached a whole new level. In December of 1995, 9 months prior to the murder of Tupac Shakur, an individual named Mark Anthony Bell had attended a death row Christmas party up in the Hollywood Hills.
And Suge Knight thinks that Mark Anthony Bell can tell him where Puffy lives because they wanted some kind of harm to come to Sean Puffy Combs.
He was accosted by Suge Knight, Tupac Shakur, and other members of the Mob Piru, just a small blood gang. Mark Bell was taken into a private room and beaten severely. At this point, Sean Combs was in fear for his life. He knew that Suge Knight was hunting him down.
Beatings, shootings. Obviously, Biggie and Tupac were around people who weren't afraid to get their hands bloody. So it's easy for me to believe that both murders are somehow related to their record labels. Okay, if Combs thought Suge was coming after him, was it possible that he tried to strike first against Death Row by ordering a hit on Suge's top earner, Tupac? We have motive, but is there any evidence linking Combs to the Vegas shooters?
We knew that in Las Vegas, on the night of Tupac Shakur's shooting, that Tupac had been in a physical altercation with a Southside Crip gang member by the name of Orlando Anderson.
The atmosphere back then between the Crips and the Bloods was very violent, very dangerous. These were violent and still are violent gangs.
So that fight at the MGM between Tupac Shakur and Orlando Anderson would be a natural place to start to look at Anderson as a possible suspect. Orlando Anderson was a violent gang member. He had been looked at for murders prior to this, and we had individuals within his own group of friends that were coming to law enforcement saying, hey, Orlando did it. Ultimately, we acquired a confession from an individual named Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, who just happened to be the uncle of Orlando Anderson. And in that confession, Keefe D. came forward and said that he was in the car that night in Las Vegas. He was in the white Cadillac with the shooter when the shooting occurred. And then he began to explain his personal history with Puffy Combs and how he had been solicited to carry out the murder of Tupac Shakur. Keefe D's confession is making some very strong allegations against a very powerful individual.
It was a hit on him and Suge, not just Pac, on Suge too.
Sean Combs was extremely desperate. He was in fear for his life. And so it was this environment of desperation and fear that caused Combs to solicit this murder from a gang member.
He put a hit out on Pac for $1 million. The gangsters would have did it for $5,000. When he told them that he would give them $1 million, they'd have killed him right in front of the Pope.
Keefe D advised us that the beating of Orlando Anderson at the MGM set the stage for Tupac's murder. That was what put into motion an agreement that had already taken place.
They played out like this. Orlando calls his uncle, man, that mother just, let's go, he just stomped me out. He's X'd out, he's done. Orlando's uncle says he stomped you out, you knock him off. You know what I'm saying? Instead of me doing it, you do it. And that's exactly what happened.
However, this information is being brought to our attention in 2009. It's been 13 years now since Tupac was murdered. And we know that we're going to have to corroborate this confession on multiple levels before we can move forward and say that this is not only a viable confession, but the definitive explanation.
So I read through the transcripts of Keefe D's 3-hour confession. Problem is, there's no way to prove he's telling the truth. And he admits he never got the $1 million he was supposedly offered by Combs. In fact, they haven't even spoken. I mean, Keefe says, I quote, "I tried to call them several times, though. If he would have just given us half the money, I would have stayed strong." On top of that, the alleged shooter, Orlando Anderson, died in 1998. So unless Combs decides to come clean, I have no way of corroborating this confession. But regardless, Keefe didn't go to the police until 2009. Suge had no way of knowing all this back in 1996. I'm wondering who he thought was responsible and what he did about it.
Immediately after the murder of Tupac Shakur in Las Vegas, the shooting in which Suge Knight was also struck with gunfire, he was enraged, distraught over the loss of Tupac Shakur, and also personally offended that he himself had been targeted. It was out of this sense of vengeance that Suge Knight decided to hire a gang member, an individual who had a history of shooting people, and solicited the murder of Biggie Smalls. The individual that Suge Knight had hired to kill Christopher Wallace was a guy named Wardell Faust, also known as Poochie. Leading up to his murder, Biggie Smalls had been in Los Angeles for several weeks.
He was very flamboyant. He acted like he was the king of L.A., like he dethroned Tupac.
When Biggie Smalls came out to Los Angeles, his security was very lax.
Suge Knight was in prison, serving time on a violation of parole for kicking and beating up Orlando Anderson in Las Vegas.
Everybody thought, hey, the boogeyman has been put away, so we don't have to worry about being out on the West Coast anymore.
Bad Boy Records and Puffy Combs and Biggie Smalls came out here believing that they no longer needed that type of security element that they'd previously been using, and that was a fatal mistake.
In 1996, Tupac Shakur was shot dead in Las Vegas. 6 months later, Christopher Wallace, a.k.a. Biggie Smalls, was shot dead on the streets of Los Angeles. Two eerily similar murders forever linked and still unsolved. Were they victims of an East Coast-West Coast rap rivalry? Or was that just a cover for something more sinister? The common theory is that Tupac and Biggie were collateral damage in a deadly war between Sean Combs and Bad Boy Records in the East versus Suge Knight and Death Row Records in the West. And with a history of violence between the two groups, including beatings and shootings, it's easy to understand why. However, no arrests were ever made because there's no evidence that directly implicates either Puffy or Suge in either murder. It's all circumstantial. So what if it isn't as simple as just an East Coast, West Coast thing? There are a lot of players in the game with a lot of different motives. The question is, was there anyone else who stood to gain from the deaths of Tupac and Biggie? And if the killings are related and Tupac was killed first, it's natural to start with him. So, who would profit the most from Tupac's death?
Russell Poole was assigned to the Biggie Smalls case, and they made him the lead investigator. Russell's theory was that Suge Knight was behind the murder of Tupac Shakur. And he felt that Suge was brazen enough to sit in the driver's seat while Tupac was being shot in the passenger seat.
There was a motive on the part of Suge Knight to go out and have Tupac killed or assassinated. Tupac was threatening to leave the record label. He was reaching out on his own. He wasn't happy with the arrangements that they had as far as the money he was receiving. There were a lot of reasons that Tupac wanted to go off and do his own thing, and that's pretty much been proven to be true.
Tupac passed away with no money. Even though he was selling millions of records, he wasn't getting checks. You know, when Tupac needed something, Suge had to get it. It's kind of like Suge Knight was holding his purse. And just like so many other artists who were jumping ship at that time, Tupac wanted out.
If Tupac was going to leave Death Row Records, there's a chance that he could have sued and he could have taken his music back and released it on a different label. Death Row Records and Suge Knight wouldn't want that to happen, so why not kill Tupac?
I think at the time of Tupac's death, Suge Knight did owe him like $10 million, and I'm not really sure where all that money went, but it definitely didn't go to Pac. When you think about how callously he's treated other individuals that he's had relationships with, it's not beyond the realm of imagination that Suge Knight would have done something like this.
I mean, this is a man who supposedly dangled Vanilla Ice from a balcony. All of the clues pointed towards this theory that Suge Knight may have been behind this murder. Tupac really did not want to go to Las Vegas. But Suge says, look, come down to Las Vegas, we'll smooth this whole thing over, and I'm gonna pay you everything I owe you. On the night Tupac was killed, they didn't have adequate security for Tupac.
It was always supposed to have been a two-man detail with Tupac. Those were standing orders. But it was only one guy that went with him to the fight.
They were told not to carry weapons that night. One of the bodyguards, Michael Moore, refused to relinquish his weapon. He had a permit to carry it, and he didn't want to give up his weapon. So Reggie Wright, the head of Death Row Security, told Michael Moore to go to Club 662 and stand detail there, taking him off of Tupac for the rest of that night.
That would have been a gun on Tupac at the time.
That left one guy in charge of one of the highest paid rappers out there, and this guy doesn't have a gun or a walkie-talkie.
Clearly, something was going to go down where they might have needed those weapons, and they didn't want anybody shooting back. Right at the time Tupac was shot, Michael Moore heard "Got him" come over the radio. So clearly there were spotters. There were people who were telling everybody that was in on it what was happening, kind of a play-by-play over the radios.
All of these elements contributed to this theory that Suge Knight was essentially responsible.
So Tupac was killed by Suge Knight for the hundreds of millions of dollars that music was going to generate.
But why would Suge Knight kill Biggie Smalls?
Biggie Smalls was killed to cover Suge Knight's tracks, to galvanize the East Coast-West Coast feud, and to throw investigators off the track of who actually perpetrated these murders.
The year Tupac was killed, he sold $60 million worth of albums. To date, he's moved 75 million units, and his estate has made at least 7 figures every year since his death. So, yeah, I can see why Suge would have had motive to kill to keep Shakur at death row. However, there is one glaring hole that makes me seriously question this theory. Why would Suge sit next to Tupac in the tight enclosed interior of a car if he knew bullets were about to start flying at Tupac?
Many Suge Knight apologists attack the belief that Suge Knight had anything to do with Tupac being killed, because why would Suge Knight be in the car with Tupac if Tupac was going to be the intended target? Many years later, new evidence surfaced. We received a letter from a well-respected reporter with Fox News. And it had been a letter that he had been given many years earlier. And this letter was given to him by people who had alleged themselves to be part of the shooting. In this letter, an entire motive was laid out as to why the shooting took place, and it painted Suge Knight as an intended target.
He was not behind the crime. Suge Knight was meant to be murdered the night Tupac was shot.
In 1996, Tupac Shakur was shot dead in Las Vegas. 6 months later, Christopher Wallace, a.k.a. Biggie Smalls, was shot dead on the streets of Los Angeles. 2 eerily similar murders forever linked and still unsolved. Were they victims of an East Coast-West Coast rap rivalry? Or was that just a cover for something more sinister? So what do we know so far? On the surface, it looked like Tupac and Biggie were victims of an East Coast-West Coast war. But after digging deeper, I learned Tupac was planning on leaving death row, a move that would cause Suge Knight's record label to lose millions. As some believe, Suge was willing to kill to keep Tupac's publishing rights. And with that much money at stake, anything's possible. But if Suge ordered the hit, what was he doing in the car, sitting shoulder to shoulder with the target? I mean, Suge is brave, but he's also shrewd. I can't imagine he'd put himself in that kind of danger. And now that I'm thinking about it, how do we know that Tupac was even the intended target? They were sitting in Suge's car, after all. Is it possible that the trigger men were aiming for Suge all along? And if so, why?
Suge Knight was actually a victim that night.
When Las Vegas police started the investigation, they focused on the shooting of Shakur. But if you take Tupac out of it, it was the shooting of a head of a record label. If somebody had shot at David Geffen or Steven Spielberg driving in their car, we'd see police all over the place investigating this. But because of Suge Knight's gang affiliations and because of the things he was tied up in, even the shooting of a head of a record label wasn't enough to get traction. Many years later, new evidence surfaced, including a confession letter and a new witness that stepped forward, whose name was Death Row Dave, and Death Row Dave happened to be Suge's limousine driver.
A journalist named Chris Blatchford brings out the confession letter. It says, you know, I don't know if you're interested in this, but I received it in 1998.
I believe what the confession letter says has weight. I believe it has merit.
The confession letter basically lines everything up so that all of the things Russell believed about Death Row Records being behind a murder, all of those clues line up with this.
According to the letter, certain parties that were affiliated with Suge Knight were very unhappy with the way that Suge Knight was running Death Row Records. Reggie Wright, Suge's head of security, who himself always wanted to run a record label, had an interest in watching Suge Knight not be here anymore. Now, allegedly, Death Row Records had been started with drug money. And some might say the record label was involved with money laundering. So you have Suge Knight running an organization that most of the players involved would prefer to keep quiet. But Suge, unfortunately, decided he wanted to believe his own press. So every time Suge Knight showed up to do something, the media was there. And he started showing up on the cover of magazines. And suddenly it became more about Suge Knight, the celebrity, Suge Knight, the guy who was out front. And it was drawing a lot of attention to some people that really didn't want to have that kind of attention.
In 1996, Death Row Records is worth $500 million. There's a lot of people that are really upset with Suge at the time. And so if you're Reggie Wright Jr., it only makes sense that if something's worth $500 million and you're tired of being harassed by the guy who runs it, why not just kill him and take it from him? Guns, drugs, jealousy, money. This is a really bad formula here. And it all comes to a head on September the 7th, 1996.
The alleged shooters were Piru Bloods.
According to the confession letter, they were hired by Reggie Wright Jr. at what was supposedly a gang summit. Reggie Wright Jr. is the head of security. He's the one who decides whether or not people have guns, what routes they're going to drive. So he's in a perfect position to know where the people are going to be if they're going to be murdered.
Reggie Wright provided information as to the whereabouts and locations of the crew at the time that they were in Las Vegas for the Tyson Seldon fight.
You look at what happens after Tupac is killed and after Suge goes to jail, you have complete confusion at Death Row Records. It's total chaos until Suge signs over the record label to Reggie Wright Jr., and then all the chaos stops.
So you have this alleged confession letter and the events as they transpired in Las Vegas, and one by one, as we started to look at the letter and look at the allegations that were made in it, this letter began to get legs on its own.
We started to realize that maybe Suge Knight had absolutely nothing to do with Biggie's death either, because he was in prison.
And everybody wants to say, oh, Suge Knight was making phone calls from prison and Suge Knight was dictating, and he certainly could have if he had wanted to, but I don't believe personally that Suge Knight called out for the killing of Biggie Smalls as retaliation for the killing of Tupac Shakur.
But that doesn't mean that Suge's people weren't very active in bringing down Biggie Smalls. Everything started to come full circle. It started to lead back to Death Row Records.
Conspirators that wanted to take out Suge Knight at the time, they had a real problem on their hands because now Suge Knight was alive. And what are you going to tell Suge Knight? Hey, somebody just tried to shoot me. Now, if I'm the head of a rap record label and a car rolls up beside me and opens fire on me, I think I'd want to know who did it and why. So he's going to go to his head of security, Reggie Wright, and say, who tried to shoot me? Oh, we wanted to kill you. He can't give him that answer, so what does he say? Oh, it's part of an East Coast, West Coast war. It's a gang problem. Reggie Wright is pinning it on somebody that they can't track down. It's this nebulous force. It's this blob of people. So when it came time to get rid of Biggie Smalls, and this is the saddest part, Biggie was killed for no other reason than to advance this theory that the conspirators that had tried to take out Suge Knight were putting forward.
Biggie Smalls is an innocent. He did not deserve to die. He certainly did not deserve to die in this manner.
The theory that Suge was the intended target is tempting. Clearly, Suge's head of security, Reggie Wright, had 500 million reasons to kill Suge. And according to police reports, there's also evidence that after the shooting, Reggie got word to LAPD that Suge was in violation of his parole for the Orlando Anderson incident in Vegas, which got Suge sent back to the joint and put Reggie in control of Death Row. Certainly seems like Reggie was up to something, but murder? My biggest concern with this is 13 shots were fired into Suge's BMW, and they all missed. And Tupac was hit 5 times, but Suge was only grazed by a small fragment. If Suge was the real target, how did the shooters miss a 300-pound guy 13 times? In fact, that math brings me back to the original theory that Tupac was the intended target after all.
13-plus bullets come at Tupac from the passenger side. Suge Knight is driving that car to fatally wound Tupac and not seriously hurt Suge Knight at all. It's pretty amazing since Suge Knight's about 400 pounds or so, and Tupac's only about 170. Tupac's murder and Biggie's murder, these were professional hits that took professional arrangements and careful orchestration to make them happen.
In 1996, Tupac Shakur was shot and killed after a prize fight in Las Vegas. 6 months later, Christopher Wallace, a.k.a. Biggie Smalls, was shot dead on the streets of Los Angeles. 2 murders almost identical and still unsolved. Were they victims of an East Coast, West Coast rap rivalry? Or was that just a cover for something more sinister? At first glance, it appeared Tupac and Biggie were collateral damage of the notorious East Coast, West Coast rap war. Another theory is Tupac's murder was ordered by Suge Knight, while others suggest Suge was the real target and that his head of security, Reggie Wright, was trying to pull off a coup d'etat. But when you consider that all 13 of the shots that were fired missed Suge, then I think you have to question that theory. Either the shooter or shooters were incredibly good shots, or Suge is incredibly lucky. The most logical theory is that Tupac was the one in the crosshairs. But with that kind of accuracy, some believe the triggermen were most likely professional hitters. One thing I'm not short on is suspects. But before I come to any conclusions, I got to exhaust all possibilities. So now, is there anyone else with motive to kill Tupac?
I believe that the FBI conspired to orchestrate the murder of Tupac Shakur. When activists broke into the FBI office, they uncovered thousands of documents that showed a program they had that was targeting leftist activists, and particularly black leftist activists, targeting them for frame-ups and murders. And so they would have had particular interest in Tupac Shakur.
Tupac was a very powerful person at that time. He had a lot of people's ears. Tupac is this huge, influential person, and he was saying some things that a lot of people did not like.
Tupac had been head of the New African Panthers, and he was doing activist work behind the scenes while he was a top rapper. Close to that time, Tupac decided to develop a plan to appeal to gangs and politicize them. And he did that to get the Bloods and Crips to call peace truces between each other. That gang peace truce movement started to spread throughout California and throughout the country because he was gaining more success with his peace truce movement. The U.S. intelligence orchestrated Tupac Shakur's assassination.
Sometimes an opinion on a particular platform, an in-your-face, unfiltered opinion, is a threat. It's very threatening. I want to think better of the government, but I've seen so many black people killed for less.
The FBI were monitoring him very closely. Somebody who was working for the FBI, Kevin Hackey, said he had the documents to prove that the FBI had Tupac under surveillance when he was killed. Kevin Hackey was one of the top 2 bodyguards for Tupac Shakur.
Kevin Hackey was, in fact, working undercover as an informant for the ATF and the FBI.
About a week before Tupac was to go to Las Vegas the night he was killed, he told Tupac not to go to Las Vegas. 6 months after Tupac Shakur's murder, the exact same tactics were used to kill Biggie Smalls. He was what U.S. intelligence would call collateral damage. Biggie Smalls was murdered in order to make